Okay, hello YouTube. Welcome to today's Wikilection live stream. Today's topic is politics. I think for now we'll skip the initial intro. Said that a couple of times, getting used to the messaging, and might not be particularly useful until that's a bit more hashed out. So last week I made the mistake of using the wrong screen layout, so I'm just going to keep my video small the whole time so I don't forget to do that. So we will jump right into the content on politics. So as it says here, the following slides here that we'll be showing today, they're going to show what kind of information will be available for elections, and on a related note, the political parties and the politicians themselves. With a name like Wikilection, you may correctly assume that a big part of the purpose of it is to help with elections and politics. So a lot of the underlying features that we've covered in previous live streams, a lot of them were sort of made to be able to support this system. So if we look at the elections themselves, the first thing that we're going to focus on, kind of one of the highest level problems that the goal is to solve, around election issues. And these are the things that voters care about within the election. So one of the most obvious examples are going to be what we're calling ballot measures. And so those are also called like propositions or a variety of other things when you're actually voting on them. But these are specific pieces of legislation that the public gets to vote on as part of an election. And based on the voter outcome, we'll decide whether or not that's implemented. Then as well, during an election, you'll see conversations around certain topics in the media. And those are the things that will typically, show up in conversations with the candidates and sort of the main issues that the media is pushing in theory because they think that that's what the public is most interested in. And then finally, anything that's not captured by the ballot measures and the media conversation, the Wikilection community will be able to submit those issues, anything that's being overlooked, and then the community can vote on what's the most important. So if there are some important ballot measures, those would be expected to sort of go to the top of the heap. If the media is correct in that certain topics it assumes are important, then the community in theory would vote those up as well. And then anything else that's overlooked, the community will be able to rank all of those sort of compared to one another. And instead of it just being what's important and what's not, it's meant to be based on topic. So like if, for example, a certain topic has to do with the environment, the community can rank whether or not a certain election issue is relevant to the topic of the environment or environmental concerns. And then anyone in the community who said that's a concern for them, they would be more likely to see that issue sort of show up as something that they would care about, and that it would show where things are at and what information is available in that election for that issue. Now, within the elections themselves, outside of the ballot measures where you're voting on a piece of legislation, the other thing that elections tend to do is you're voting on different roles. So that might be something like mayor or city councilor, or that might be something like, the president or the leader of your country. Now, one of the important things to note here is that the goal is to show both elected and appointed positions. So for something like mayor or city councilor or president, commonly the really sort of important and what I think a lot of people would call the main roles, they have the ability to appoint positions as well. That's one of the responsibilities of that elected role. And so it's important when we're talking about what roles are being voted on, not just the role itself, but also the sort of powers and responsibilities that come with that role. So if in voting for president, that role is also responsible for appointing 20 other positions, it's important to note what those positions are, because in effect, you're kind of voting for those as well. For all of the roles that are involved, our goal is to list out the responsibilities. What does that role actually do? What does it not do? And have the conversation around what does that actually do? I think there's a lot of conversations if somebody is, trying to compete for, especially a kind of a fairly powerful position. It's not terribly uncommon for campaign platforms and things being discussed to be maybe outside of what somebody in that role could actually do. So identify what they can and can't do. Then related to those responsibilities, what skills are typically required by somebody fulfilling that role? That might be like the actual individual skills, but it might just be, common previous history, the other industries or the other professions that people in this role who do well, what industries and skill sets kind of are they coming from? And then finally, for the election issues that we mentioned just a minute ago, which of those issues are relevant to that role, which is tied into the responsibilities and the skills required. If there's an election issue that has to do with, how we might afford a certain thing or how we might pay for a certain service that people want, then roles that are related to that challenge of, where can we get the money from? How can we fund that? That might be directly related to a role to do with, gathering funds and how to finance things. Essentially, not all of the election issues will be relevant for all of the roles being voted on. And the goal is to sort of draw a line so we can tell this is the role that experts in the community agree has sort of the best chance to affect that election issue. And finally, once that information is available, so the issues that are important and the actual roles that are being voted on, within each role, we want to look at the candidates available, whether it's just sort of two people competing or whether it's, a broad field and there's 10 or more. This is a very sort of simplified list. The idea here is there's going to be a lot of information for the candidates. And now one of the main things to focus on is their experience. So sort of what separates one candidate from the other. What's the platform that they're running on? What are the things that they've actually said? Here's not just how I'm different as a person, but here's how the platform that I'm running on, the things that I say I'm going to achieve, here's how that's different from the other candidates. Any election issues that are sort of decided as important by the community, but especially those that also directly tie into the role the person is competing for, we want to know their stances on those issues. And those stances might come just in the form of, a clip from a campaign rally or a clip from like a TV news interview. But ideally, it actually comes directly in the form of that candidate or their team directly answering and sort of providing more information on where they stand on those issues. I also want to know for that candidate, if we take a look at all of the different claims or statements that they've made, especially over the course of that campaign, the goal is to get an idea for how accurate that is. Are they accurate 90% of the time? So 9 out of 10 times when that person says something or makes a claim as to what a certain study meant, that when the community and experts look at those claims, is 9 and 10 correct? Or maybe, it's down to like the 3 or 2 out of 10 range, to know how commonly this person can sort of be trusted to be accurately relaying information. And then if possible, we want to see if this person is competing for an elected position, if that position allows them to appoint people, any appointees that they've sort of made ahead of time, to know who those people are. So a common example there might be, if somebody is competing for president of the United States, who's their vice president? Have they made it clear, who any of the secretaries of the various departments, have they hinted or, said who would be in those roles? So we can start to look at those people as candidates for those roles as well. Now, if we go one level deeper, and we're actually looking at sort of the people in the in politics themselves. We're splitting that out into the groups of the politicians, as well as the political parties that those politicians are grouped in. So when we're looking at politicians, one very important thing, especially in terms of that politician within an election, is their campaign promises. So if somebody is running for re-election, as I said just on the previous slide, we're going to track what their campaign platform is, sort of why they should be re-elected in this case. But one of the useful pieces of information that we have for a politician that's running for re-election or somebody that has previous experience is you can look at the promises they made in previous elections and find out what the outcome was, which kind of is a similar conversation to the accuracy and seeing, how often they're accurate when they make statements, what percentage of their campaign promises were delivered. And this might be separated out into sort of their main party platform, sorry, not their party platform, their main election platform. So as a candidate, what are they saying that they're going to do? Their key things versus, maybe they just gave a answer to a question in a campaign rally that would still be a campaign promise, but not sort of one of their key ones. So that there might be some level of separation on the promises that they said time and time again, and that's sort of one of the main reasons why they're running versus the other things that they say. We want to keep an eye on both in office and when they're in an election running for office, where they get their funding from. So this is things like, who's paying for their campaign, but then also when they're actually in office, if there's any other sort of gifts or payments received, to be able to track where that's coming from and, who's paying it and sort of what kind of ties that gives the person. Are they now beholden to a certain industry, that kind of thing. We want to know their legislation history. So that's including the legislation that they've actually proposed, anything they've sponsored, and then how they're actually voting on legislation once that comes time to vote on whether they either should do their own legislation or competing legislation. And now that's not just how they voted yes or no, similar to how we'd be reviewing the evidence and the underlying content for accuracy. For legislation, we'd be reviewing what is this legislation sort of good for and bad for? What are the pros and cons? What groups agree with it, disagree with it? So as we see somebody sponsoring or voting on different legislation, you can see what sort of themes you can find in their legislation history. What do they tend to vote on? What do they tend to vote against? Next, we have the important events. That's kind of a broad term to encompass things that might still be like, an especially important piece of legislation that they, sponsored or voted for or against. But that can also be simple things like scandals or crimes, where the goal is to have sort of a timeline of important things to note about that person. And just like everything else, the community can vote on what the most important events are based on category. And then finally, the politicians will be tracked in the same area and in a lot of the same ways as the experts, as mentioned in a previous live stream. And just like how with experts, the goal is to track the claims that they've made for sort of what certain evidence or what certain reports might mean, and then to track how accurate those claims are over time. So this is a bit different than their promises saying, I'll do this or I'll make sure this doesn't happen. This is them trying to sort of possibly justify one of their campaign promises or fight for or against something, just to give you an idea on when someone is saying this study or this piece of information means something, how often can you trust that? Now, on the other side of that, as well as tracking the individual politicians, we want to track the parties as well. And a lot of the information that we'll be tracking will sort of involve both, because politicians, especially in areas that use political parties, they'll belong to a party, and quite often they're, heavily influenced by their party's platform, and in some cases straight up kind of forced to say, if you want to be a member of this party, you have to vote with the party or the party leadership. So for the individual parties, we want to track what the party platform is. So regardless of what an individual politician says or doesn't say in a campaign or while in office, you can get an idea for all the people that make up that party, how they tend to vote. If you're a member of that party, there's a really good chance that you're going to be sort of following the party lines and voting in that same way. You can also look at where the party gets its funding from. So that is, individual politicians can get funding for their campaigns, but quite often a politician is at least partially funded by their party, who then gets the party gets their money from another group as well. So it's the same conversation around sort of where does the money come from and who do they owe a favor to? You can look at the party leadership, and this is specifically talking about the people and sort of the kinds of people in charge of that party with a similar history behind them. You can learn a lot about a party by who they choose to elect as a leader, the kinds of things the leader says and promises, and the kinds of platforms that they have. And then as well, you can have important events for the parties themselves, just like you would for any other kind of an organization. That does become particularly important for politicians because, again, they're sort of so closely tied to their party. There was something else I wanted to touch on and how these relate. I'm going to see if I can remember that. Check for any comments. Oh. Okay, I'm not remembering what that was. As you may have noticed, this is a fairly simple presentation for now, still working on some of the sort of infographic plans or some ways to explain this a bit better visually, but hopefully this gives some form of an idea on the kinds of information that would be available for politics. So that's from the elections themselves. And then on politics, I guess one important thing to note is things like the legislation history. That is one of the best forms of evidence that we could kind of ask for, assuming that the government makes that information available. Many governments have rules in place that say that the voting history and spending history and a bunch of the information that we'll be relying on for politicians, that's public knowledge, which means that there, in theory, is less of a battle to decide sort of if something is legitimate or not. There's still the conversation around, what people are saying about it and what the stats mean and how those translate. So there still needs to be that conversation on what experts are saying about the information and having them justify that. But the information coming from the government becomes a lot harder to dispute when you can link to that information on the actual, the government sites, and you can say that this was pulled from the government information. So if that's wrong, that's not necessarily a good thing for the government to be saying that the information that they're providing is incorrect. So that is one of the better forms of evidence available to justify any of the information on Wikilection, which is good, given that one of the key points is to sort of help make sense of politics and politicians and all the information around that topic. So I think that's probably it for today's session. We will be restructuring, I think, how the live streams work as I've gone through and looked at the information being presented and sort of some of the improvements I've been making to the content and how to explain it. It'll follow probably fairly similar approach to the live streams. We might be grouping some of them, but you will see changes in the coming weeks for how these are done. These might also change to every other week, simply because some of the conversations that I was planning to have on this channel will actually be moving into a different sort of channel and project currently called Together Tech, where the goal is to work with other projects similar to this to find like what does the public and what do people need to know from an organization like this in order to trust it. And And I think that's a much better way to have it, because having the conversation, but sort of by myself in this format, probably not the most useful, as opposed to having a group of people deciding what they'd want as citizens from each other's projects. Then we can take that information and apply it to our own. So you will see some of those changes coming in the future. And one of the forms that we'll take is these live streams, I'm thinking, will become every other week. If this information looks interesting and you're looking to learn more about Wikilection, you can check out the website, which is www.wikilection.com. There's also facebook.com/Wikilection and patreon.com/Wikilection. Those are sort of the three most active and have the most information. There is quite a bit of information on the Wikilection homepage, as far as there's prototypes up and some screenshots and talking about all this in a bit more detail. And as well, you can look at this YouTube channel itself and look at the previous recordings to see the other versions of these live streams and anything else that we've put out since then. But I think that is it for today. Let me just double check. Yep, no comments. So we'll call it for today. And keep an eye on, I would say the Facebook channel is probably the best place right now. And we'll have some more information on what the timing is going to be, and if and when we'll switch to it being every other week. And then as well, for any new information about that new model for Together Tech, and how to make sure that sort of the organizational part of this is being designed and presented in a way that makes sense amongst other projects to sort of come up with a framework. So look forward to seeing you there. Thanks. Bye.